My name is Charles Whitfield. I'm 70 years old, and 20 minutes after my son told me, at his own promotion party, that nobody respects me, his company's CEO walked through the door, crossed an entire room full of executives, extended his hand to me first, and said, "Sir, it's genuinely an honor. I've been hoping to meet you for years. Welcome to Silent Honor, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most, and still choose to show up for them anyway." If you've ever been dismissed by someone whose respect mattered enormously to you, only to watch a stranger reveal exactly what that person had never bothered to ask about, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight, and hit subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly what happened in that room. Let me start where this really begins. I spent 26 years in the Army, the last 11 of them as a battalion commander, leading soldiers through training exercises and 2 overseas deployments that shaped, more than anything else in my life, the particular way I understand leadership, discipline, and the specific difference between authority that's given and authority that's actually earned. My wife Doreen passed 6 years ago, and since then, I've lived a genuinely quiet retirement in a modest house outside a small town, keeping myself busy with a garden, volunteer work at the local VFW post, and the particular unhurried rhythm of a man who spent decades operating under considerable pressure and has genuinely earned the right to slow down. My son Marcus is 34 now, working in corporate operations for a rapidly growing logistics technology company, the kind of ambitious, fast-moving business environment that requires an entirely different vocabulary than the one I spent my career operating within. Marcus has built a genuinely impressive career for himself, working his way up through several promotions over the past 6 years, and the evening this story centers on was meant to celebrate his most significant promotion yet, to senior director, an achievement he'd worked hard for and genuinely deserved. I want to be careful here, because I don't think Marcus is fundamentally an unkind person. But over the years since Doreen passed, I noticed a specific pattern developing in how he presented me to his professional world. A pattern rooted, I've come to understand, in a particular anxiety about how my more plain, unpolished military background might land among his increasingly sophisticated corporate colleagues. There was a company holiday party about 2 years ago when Marcus introduced me to several of his coworkers as, "My dad retired from the Army, does a lot of gardening these days." A description accurate as far as it went, but delivered with a specific brevity that closed the subject before anyone had a chance to ask a real question about the 26 years that description had compressed down to almost nothing. There was a dinner the following year when one of Marcus's colleagues asked, with genuine curiosity, what rank I'd achieved during my service, and Marcus answered for me, quickly, "Something mid-level, I think. Honestly, I've never fully kept track of all the military rank stuff," a response that struck me, hearing it, as a strange thing for a son to say about a father whose rank he'd actually known clearly his entire life. There was a golf outing, about a year before the promotion party, where Marcus introduced me to a group of his colleagues as, "My dad used to be in the Army, does a lot of gardening these days." The exact same brief, flattened description he'd used at the holiday party, delivered again with the specific efficiency of a man who'd rehearsed the shortest possible version of his father's career, one that closed the subject before it could develop into anything requiring further explanation. There was a Sunday dinner about 8 months ago when Marcus's girlfriend at the time asked me directly about my time as a battalion commander, genuinely curious, and before I could answer properly, Marcus redirected the conversation toward a work story of his own, a pattern I noticed repeating often enough over subsequent gatherings that I eventually stopped expecting my own answers to actually land before he'd already moved the conversation elsewhere. There was an afternoon about 6 months ago when I overheard Marcus on the phone with a colleague through the open door of his home office during a visit, describing an upcoming networking event and mentioning, almost apologetically, "My dad's coming to this one. He's sweet but definitely not exactly polished for this crowd. Might need to keep an eye on the conversation topics." I stood in that hallway for a good 10 seconds, listening to my own son describe 26 years of military leadership as something requiring careful management in front of his colleagues, and then I continued toward the kitchen, saying nothing about what I'd heard. He never knew I'd heard a word. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't angry at Marcus in the way people are angry at strangers. Marcus loved me, genuinely, but had absorbed, over years of building his own career in an entirely different professional world, a particular anxiety about how my background might be perceived, an anxiety that had quietly reshaped how he presented me. Gradually enough that I don't think he'd ever consciously examined the pattern until the specific evening everything came to a head. The promotion party itself was held at a genuinely upscale venue Marcus's company had rented, an elegant space filled with his colleagues, several senior executives, and a scattering of family members there to celebrate the occasion. I arrived in my one good suit, genuinely proud of my son, looking forward to an evening celebrating an achievement he'd worked hard for. About an hour into the party, standing near a small group that included several of Marcus's colleagues, I made a comment, intended warmly, about how the corporate world's approach to leadership development reminded me, in certain ways, of officer training programs I'd overseen during my military career, drawing a comparison I genuinely thought might be interesting to a group of people building careers in organizational leadership. I noticed, partway through the comparison, a certain restlessness in Marcus's expression, and afterward, as the small group dispersed toward the bar, he pulled me aside into a quieter corner of the venue, his voice low but sharp in a way that caught me entirely off guard. "Dad, can you please not do the whole military leadership lecture thing? This isn't a VFW meeting. These are serious people, executives who've built real careers in this industry, and honestly, nobody respects you bringing up battalion command comparisons at a tech company promotion party. It just makes things awkward." I want to be honest about what I felt hearing that, standing in that quiet corner in my one good suit, having spent an hour genuinely trying to engage thoughtfully with my son's professional world. "Nobody respects me," I repeated, keeping my voice level despite what I was actually feeling. "That's not exactly what I meant," Marcus said, though the correction came a beat too late to feel entirely convincing. "I just mean, in this specific context, with these specific people, it's not really landing the way you probably want it to. These are serious business people, Dad, and I don't think leadership advice from 20 years ago in a totally different context is really what they're looking for tonight." I didn't have an immediate response to that. I want to tell you honestly what happened in me in that moment, because I think it matters more than any composed version I might otherwise offer you. 26 years of military service, the specific discipline of leading soldiers through circumstances considerably more consequential than a corporate promotion party, had just been dismissed, by my own son, as something that made things awkward in front of serious people. Let me pause the story right here for just a second, because I want to ask you something, watching at home right now. Have you ever been told plainly by someone you love that your hard-earned experience simply didn't belong in the room they'd invited you into? How did you carry that, and did anyone in that room ever come to understand what had actually just been dismissed? Tell me in the comments, because I read every single one, and if this story is already feeling familiar, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because what happened 20 minutes later is the part of this story you really don't want to miss. I want to describe what happened next exactly as it occurred, because it's the moment everything changed, and it began without me saying a single word to start it. About 20 minutes after that quiet corner conversation, a stir moved through the room, the particular ripple that happens when someone genuinely important enters a space full of people eager to make a good impression. Marcus's company CEO, a man named Gregory Vance, had arrived, later than expected, apologizing to the room generally for the delay, before beginning to work his way through the crowd, shaking hands, offering brief congratulations to Marcus and various other attendees. I watched Gregory Vance's progress through the room with the mild, distant interest of someone who understood he was unlikely to have any meaningful interaction with a company's CEO, standing near the edge of the gathering, still carrying the specific quiet weight of what Marcus had just said to me. Then Gregory Vance's eyes landed on me directly, and I watched his expression shift, in the space of a few seconds, from polite social scanning to something considerably more focused, a kind of stunned, searching recognition that made him stop mid-conversation with someone else entirely and begin crossing the room with clear purpose. "Sir," he said, extending his hand toward me with an urgency that made several nearby conversations pause, "it's genuinely an honor. I've been hoping to meet you for years. Colonel Whitfield, is that right? Marcus's father? I want to tell you honestly what happened in me in that moment, because I think it matters." Something that had been quiet since that corner conversation opened its eyes, not with vindication exactly, but with a kind of tired, unexpected clarity, the specific stillness of a man watching a stranger extend, unprompted, exactly the recognition his own son had just withheld. "That's right," I said. "Though it's been years since anyone's used that rank with me. I served under a battalion command structure you personally reformed, sir," Gregory said, still holding my hand in an enthusiastic handshake that had drawn the attention of most of the room by now. "Fort Benning, 2004. Though you wouldn't have known me directly, I was a young lieutenant at the time, but the leadership framework you implemented across the battalion, the specific approach to developing junior officers, that framework fundamentally shaped how I think about organizational leadership to this day. I've referenced your training philosophy in at least 3 different leadership seminars I've given over the years, sir, always without knowing whether you were even still alive, let alone that I'd somehow end up as your son's CEO. What exactly do you remember about the framework?" I asked, genuinely curious now despite the strangeness of the moment. "The mentorship pairing structure, mostly," Gregory said. "You paired every junior officer with a senior NCO, specifically chosen for complementary weaknesses rather than similar strengths, forcing genuine dialogue instead of simple deference. I've built our entire leadership development program around that exact principle, sir, though I've always credited it generically to a former commanding officer in presentations, never having a name to actually attach to it." "I hadn't realized that particular approach traveled quite that far," I said, and I want to be honest that something in my chest, still carrying the weight of Marcus's comment 20 minutes earlier, genuinely loosened hearing a stranger describe, with such specific accuracy, work I'd built decades ago and rarely discussed since. Marcus, standing nearby, had gone very still, his expression moving through several rapid transformations: confusion, then a dawning, disbelieving recognition, then something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine shock as the room's attention shifted entirely toward a conversation he'd tried to discourage 20 minutes earlier. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying across the quieting room, "you know Gregory? I mean, you actually trained him?" "I trained a great many young officers over the years," I said. I didn't realize Gregory was one of them until just now. Gregory turned to Marcus, his expression still carrying genuine, visible enthusiasm. "Marcus, your father's leadership philosophy is genuinely legendary in certain military circles. I've told this story at 3 separate company retreats, about a battalion commander who completely reformed how junior officer development worked, cutting attrition rates dramatically by focusing on actual mentorship instead of pure hierarchy. I had no idea, until this exact moment, that the man I've been referencing anonymously for years was standing in my own company's promotion party. The weeks that followed were their own kind of complicated. There's a version of this story where the party is the climax and everything after is a footnote, but that's not how these things actually resolve, and I want to be honest about that. Real resolution is slow. It's Marcus calling me the following day, his voice unsteady in a way I hadn't heard from him in years, asking if we could talk properly about what had happened. "Dad," he said, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table, "I need to actually understand how badly I misjudged that moment. Gregory's been talking about you at the office all week. Half my department now knows my father is apparently some kind of leadership legend in military circles, and I told you, 20 minutes before that happened, that nobody respects you." "I remember exactly what you said," I told him, keeping my voice level but not softening the moment either. "I've been sitting with that phrase since Gregory said 'sir' to you," Marcus said. I think I've spent years assuming your military experience was something to carefully manage around my professional world, something that might make me look unsophisticated by association, and I never once actually asked real questions about what that experience actually involved, what kind of respect you might have genuinely earned within it. That's an honest thing to notice, I said. But Marcus, I need you to understand something before we go any further. I'm not upset because Gregory's recognition validated my ego. I built that leadership philosophy because it mattered to me, because I genuinely believed in developing officers who could think independently rather than simply follow orders. What actually concerns me is that you felt comfortable enough, in front of your colleagues, telling me nobody respects me, based on almost no actual investigation into what I'd spent 26 years building. You're right, he said, and his voice cracked slightly. I think I built an entire understanding of you around the most convenient, simplified version. Retired Army, does some gardening now, and I never once thought to ask what was actually underneath that summary, because some part of me had already decided military experience from a totally different world couldn't possibly be relevant or impressive to the people I was trying to impress myself. Let me pause again for just a moment, because I think this next part matters considerably. Gregory Vance, in the weeks following that party, reached out to me directly, asking if I'd be willing to speak with his company's leadership development team about the officer training framework he'd referenced. An invitation that led, over the following months, to an ongoing, genuinely meaningful consulting relationship, helping Gregory's company build a mentorship program modeled partly on principles I'd developed decades earlier in a completely different professional context. I watched my son, in the weeks after that first conversation, do something I hadn't fully seen him do before. At a subsequent company event, when a colleague asked about my background, Marcus answered before I could, with something that sounded, for the first time, like genuine pride rather than careful management. My father commanded an Army battalion for over a decade and developed a leadership philosophy that our own CEO has been quietly referencing in seminars for years without knowing the source. I told him, at my own promotion party, that nobody respects him. I don't think I'll ever fully forgive myself for how wrong that turned out to be. I didn't feel triumphant when the whole situation finally settled. I want to be honest about that too. I felt tired. The particular tired that comes after finally setting down a story you'd carried quietly, mostly alone, for years. I thought about Doreen a great deal in those weeks, wondering what she would have made of watching our son finally reckon with an assumption he'd carried, largely unexamined, right up until a chance encounter forced the reckoning into the open in front of an entire room. It's been almost a year now since that promotion party. Marcus calls regularly now, genuine conversations rather than the careful, managed politeness that characterized much of our relationship in the years before that evening. He's asked, more than once, real questions about my military career, questions that come from actual curiosity rather than polite conversation. And he's stopped, entirely, the specific habit of preemptively managing how I might be perceived among his professional colleagues. The consulting work with Gregory's company continues, genuinely meaningful work that has, in its own way, given me a renewed sense of purpose I hadn't expected to find in retirement. Marcus has sat in on 2 of those consulting sessions now, genuinely engaged, taking notes, asking questions that suggest he's actually trying to understand the framework rather than simply observing politely. I think about that corner conversation often now, sitting in my garden some evenings, genuinely at peace with a retirement I've built alongside decades of leadership experience. Very few people who meet me casually would ever guess I carry. How much of the people we love we simply never fully see, not because they're hiding anything deliberately, but because we've already decided, based on a narrow, convenient summary, exactly what shape their respect is allowed to take in a given room. Marcus looked at me for years and saw a retired soldier who might make things awkward among serious business people. He wasn't entirely wrong that I don't naturally speak the vocabulary of his corporate world. He was wrong about nearly everything else. I think, too, about how easily a genuine achievement can shrink down into a brief, convenient summary once enough years and enough different social contexts have passed. 26 years of command, thousands of soldiers trained and mentored, a leadership framework still quietly shaping organizations Marcus himself works within, all of it eventually compressed, in casual conversation, into retired army, does some gardening now. I don't think that compression happened out of any real disrespect on Marcus's part, not originally. I think it happened the way most compressions happen, gradually, through repetition, until the shorter version simply became easier to reach for than the fuller, more complicated truth. I don't regret the years of quietly carrying my military leadership background without insisting Marcus fully understand its actual weight. I want to say that plainly, because I know some people hearing this will wonder why I let the "nobody respects you" comment stand, even briefly, without immediately correcting it myself. I think some assumptions require exactly the kind of undeniable, external evidence that Gregory's recognition happened to provide. Evidence that arrives, sometimes, through circumstances neither of us could have planned or predicted, rather than a father insisting on his own credibility in a corner conversation at his son's promotion party. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a garden in the evening, once the light has gone soft, and the only sound left is whatever the crickets have decided to contribute to the conversation. I sit in that quiet most nights now, and I don't feel any different for Gregory's recognition, or the ongoing consulting work, or even Marcus's genuinely changed tone since that party. If anything, I feel more at peace than I have in years. Not because a CEO's handshake finally validated decades of leadership work, but because my own son finally understands, in a way that's actually changed how he introduces me, what respect actually looks like when it's freely given rather than carefully managed. What I've learned, watching Marcus genuinely reckon with the gap between his assumption and the actual reality, is that sometimes the people we love need to witness, directly and undeniably, exactly what they've been dismissing, before an abstract, unspoken truth about who we actually are finally has room to land. If this story reminded you of a moment when someone you love dismissed your hard-earned experience in front of people whose opinion mattered to them, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe every quiet, unassuming person deserves to be seen for the respect they've actually earned, not just the summary someone else decided was convenient, hit subscribe, because we've got a new story like this one for you every single week.